Hi, Julie Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. Happy holidays. As counterintuitive as it might seem, I actually love an icy dessert during these chilly times of year. We often eat really heavy during holiday season, so there's nothing better to me than a light, refreshing, icy dessert to kind of finish the evening or as a palate cleanser throughout the meal. So what I'm making for you is a mulled cider sorbet. I'm taking something that you traditionally know of as very hot and I'm turning it into something very cold and delicious. I do have another video about sorbets and granita, the difference between the two types of frozen desserts, and I definitely refer you off to that if you're interested in all of that technique. But the high points are this. Sorbet typically has a higher sugar content than granita. It is also churned much more rapidly as opposed to being stirred as it's frozen, which results in a much more fine crystalline structure than a granita. So sorbet tends to be a little smoother and creamier and sweeter than a granita. So those are the two primary differences between granita and sorbet, though there is a range even within sorbet. Some are going to be on the sweeter side and others are going to be on the tart side. This particular recipe tends to be on the tartar side because I want to use it as a palate cleanser mid-meal, just as much as I want to use it as a dessert. If you want a slightly sweeter version, of course, just add more sugar. This one's probably, I'm just guesstimating, somewhere in the 25 to 30% sugar by weight, which is on the low end for sorbet. They're typically in the 30 to mid-30 range. The other thing that I'm going to talk about with regard to this sorbet that I didn't talk about in my last video is how to impart flavor via an infusion. So we're going to actually steep out the flavor of the spices and the orange zest that we're putting into this by heating up the cider and letting those spices sort of dwell in that hot liquid for a period of time. That's called an infusion. So rather than adding ground spices, we're going to be adding whole spices and imparting the flavor that way. I've got 4 cups of cider in here, and for this recipe I'm using a pure apple cider with no additional sugar added. All apple cider varies in sugar concentration, so even if you follow this recipe and you get a different cider than I'm using, you might find your end sorbet has a slightly different consistency because of the sugar content. Generally, the more sugar in something, the creamier it will be, but also sugar inhibits freezing, so too much sugar and the sorbet can be kind of sloppy and never really set up. So for this 4 cups of cider with no additional sugar, I am adding half a cup plus 1 tablespoon of granulated sugar. And I'm just going to bring this to a boil. It's actually all ready to the boil, and stir it until that sugar just dissolves. You want that sugar thoroughly dissolved, otherwise you'll end up with a gritty sorbet. While this is hot and still boiling, because it's the hot that takes the flavor and draws the flavor out of the spices, I want to add these spices. I'm adding whole spices. I'm adding 5 sticks of cinnamon, 1 star anise, which is this number here. I can turn the heat off now as long as this is hot. And you can break these in half. That'll allow a little bit the flavor to kind of get into the liquid that much more readily. And 45 whole cloves. That sounds like a lot, but it's less than a tablespoon. This is pretty cinnamony, so if you want to cut the cinnamon a little bit, take out a few sticks. The cinnamon sticks are the most expensive element of this particular recipe. So back to why whole spices versus ground spices. Couple of reasons. A, just for sheer practicality, whole spices will last a heck of a lot longer in your pantry, up to 5 years if stored in cool conditions with no exposure to light. You don't want to store them near the stove, as some people do. You see the spice racks right over the oven. Not a good idea. Whereas a ground spice will usually have a year shelf life. So a lot longer shelf life. Also, in this particular recipe, we just want the flavor. I don't want the grittiness of the ground spice in the sorbet, or I'm going to get kind of a grit on my tongue when I eat that sorbet. So we're just going to get the flavor, strain out the whole spices in the end, and get the best of everything, really. I also want a little orange flavor to this. I think that's traditionally in hot mulled cider, plus it just gives it a little added kick. So I'm zesting about half of a normal size orange in here. I don't need to grate it because, again, all this is going to be strained out in the end. I just want to impart the flavor. I'm using a channel zester here, which is a great tool. It just takes off the zest in long strips. And we are going to let that steep. It's going to remain hot like this for at least 30 minutes. Bring it down to room temperature, then recontain it and sit it in your fridge overnight until it's completely chilled. You can leave the spices in. They'll have a chance to kind of meld more fully into the liquid if you leave them in overnight. If you want a less spicy overtone to the sorbet, you can strain them out immediately. But no matter what, it has to chill down completely in the fridge overnight before you can churn it. Before we do that, I'm going to add a touch of lemon juice again for a little bit more acidity and also to heighten the flavor of the spices. I've got about 2.5 tablespoons of freshly squeezed lemon juice. Give that a whirl and set that aside. Hi, I'm back. It's actually the day later, and I've got my chilled sorbet base. You can see all the spices have settled to the bottom, as well as some sediment in the cider. Sometimes some sediment kind of puts off in the boiling process when you boil the cider. So I do want to strain that out, otherwise I'll have a pretty crunchy sorbet. So what I've got here is a fine mesh strainer. I've also got a little bit of cheesecloth in it. I don't need the cheesecloth to catch the big spices, but if there's any sediment in the cider, that will strain it all on out. It'll get everything. It did move though, so I'm trying to pour directly onto the cheesecloth so none seeps out the side. This makes about 4 cups of base. And I probably only use about 3 to 3.5 cups of that in my particular ice cream maker or sorbet maker. And then if you want to get, make sure you get all the liquid out, you can just pick that up and squeeze that out. Okay. Now my base is all nicely strained, and now it's time to churn. A couple things about churning. Again, a sorbet churns at relatively high speed in an ice cream maker as opposed to being stirred like a granita. Every machine's different, so read your manufacturer's instructions before you start with it. With this Cuisinart brand, the base, the bin here, needs to be solidly frozen all the way through. Sometimes this takes more than 24 hours, so I'm shaking it. If I can hear any liquid, it means it's not frozen. But it's frozen solid, and it will melt pretty quickly at room temperature. It'll become liquid pretty quickly at room temperature, probably within 40 minutes. So as soon you want to pull it directly from the freezer, put this right in and start churning immediately. The churning process typically takes about 20 minutes in this machine. Because the churning process incorporates air, the liquid will grow in volume. It will also become lighter in color. I don't want to fill it all the way up. I want to fill it about 3/4 of the way full to allow for that pumping up of volume as it churns. So I'm going to leave it about like that. Churning blade needs to go in. Without that, it doesn't. This breaks up the crystals as they start to form on the sides of the bin. It breaks them up into smaller and smaller crystals, and that's what accounts for the creamy texture. If you don't have that in there, you're not going to get the result you want. Snap it shut, and this is going to go for about 20 minutes. I want you to observe now how dark the liquid is at start, and as it churns over the course of 20 minutes, it'll become a lot lighter and fluffier looking. And that's exactly what we want. So I think you can clearly see that what was once about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way full is now completely full to the top because of the incorporation of air during churning. It's also much lighter in color. It's also got a really nice kind of creamy, fine grain to it. That's sorbet characteristically. Just by contrast, before we serve that up, because I do want to eat that, I took the same base and I stirred it. I put it in a shallow layer in this pan, stuck it in the freezer, and stirred it as it was freezing until it was solidly frozen. And that's the process for freezing a granita, and the result, even with the same base, is a much more crystalline, much more chunky structure. So, as I said earlier in the video, though, I try to characterize granita and sorbet as these two distinct things. They really can kind of bridge each other depending on how you churn them and how much sugar you put in them. So I am going to go ahead and serve this up, and what I like to do for the holidays is be totally festive. So I've got these cute little vintage Santa cups that I would normally serve my hot cocoa or hot mulled cider in. We're going to put the sorbet in those. One comment is the sorbet freshly churned will be kind of soft. If you want a less soft consistency, I recommend sticking it in the freezer once it's churned, covering it, freezing it for another 2 to 3 hours, and then it won't melt as quickly once it hits the cup, and it'll be just a little more firm. But that preference is really yours. As I said, this one has a relatively low sugar content, so If it freezes too long, like for days, it can become more chunky and crystalline. So there I've got my sorbet in my little Santa mug, topped off with a little bit of whole spice. Some of the whole spices went into it. Purely an extra touch, but I do like the star anise. It's particularly festive. Before I eat that, I did want to tell you about why this box is sitting here, Club W. I've got another great sorbet recipe that incorporates wine, by the way, that's great for the holidays. It's a cranberry red wine sorbet, and you can find it on my website. And some of Club W wines would be perfect for that. Club W is an online wine club, and if you use my special promo code SweetLife and follow the instructions in my video description, you will get a free bottle of wine with your first purchase from Club W. So I encourage you to check that out if you're a wine drinker. Till next time, live sweetly and enjoy your holiday season.